Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the March installment of ILA's Leadership Perspectives webinar series. I am Ellen Van Velser, a Senior Fellow at the Center for Creative Leadership and a member of the board at ILA. And I'll be moderating this webinar with Barbara Kellerman, James McGregor Burns Lecturer in Public Leadership at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. Before we start, please note the following. First, this webinar will be archived. If you missed something, would like to hear the webinar again, or would like to see the presentation again, they will be published to the ILA website within 24 hours. You will receive an email with instructions for accessing the archived recording after the webinar has ended. Second, we welcome your questions throughout the webinar. Anytime, you may ask questions by typing them into the questions box of your webinar control panel, which is currently displayed on the right-hand side of your screen. We will address your questions during the second half of the webinar. Please note, however, that we may not be able to address each question we receive. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Barbara Kellerman, in addition to her current position at the Kennedy School, is a lecturer in public leadership. She was founding executive director of the Center for Public Leadership from 2000 to 2003, and from 2003 to 2006, she served as the center's research director. She's recently held professorships at Fordham, Tufts, Fairleigh Dickinson, George Washington, and Uppsala, and more recently was visiting professor of leadership at Dartmouth College. Most importantly, maybe to us, Dr. Kellerman was a co-founder of the International Leadership Association. She's written and edited many books, speaks to audiences all over the world, and among her other awards, she was ranked by Forbes.com as among the top 50 business thinkers in 2009. She'll be speaking with us today about the topic of her newest book, The End of Leadership, including how and why leadership and followership have changed, and her critical examination of whether the leadership development industry and scholarly research are keeping pace. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Barbara.
Thank you very much, Ellen, and it's a great pleasure to be here with all of you. I think we have a pretty good sized group, and I am very appreciative for your collective attention. So I look forward to the next half hour or so of talking, and then another 20-25 minutes of exchange back and forth. So, okay, well, the end of leadership, it's not quite as dire as the title would suggest. This is not to suggest or imply that leaders are no longer relevant or unimportant, but in general, it is to take a more holistic approach to the entire subject than what we've been doing for the last 30, 40 years, and to raise for your collective consideration some changes to the field that might in the future serve us better than the model of the past. So I'm going to take you through a PowerPoint which is not working at the moment. Let me see why it seems to be stuck. There we go. And I will speak to each of the slides. It's just some simple text, and I'll try to speak not too fast or not too slow in order to be able to keep pace and keep you all involved. So this book, essentially, The End of Leadership, tells two tales. The first one is about leadership and change. There is a chapter on how leadership and followership, it's always, you know me by now, I insert the word followership whenever I can, how leadership and followership have changed over the course of human history, but I particularly focus on how they have changed during the last 30, 40 years. This gets me to my second bullet point. Why do I focus on the last 30, 40 years? Because it's during that period of time that there has been what I think you would all agree, the exponential growth of what I call the leadership industry. That's a term I've coined for, and I'll read you actually from the text of the book, What Do I Mean by Leadership Industry? It's my catch-all term for the now countless leadership centers, institutes, programs, courses, seminars, workshops, experiences, trainers, books, blogs, articles, websites, webinars, videos, conferences, consultants, and coaches claiming to teach people how to lead. So the reason I wrote the book is because what I noticed is that during the exact same 30, 40-year period that the leadership industry has grown exponentially, this is the same period during which in this country in particular, the United States in particular, I realize we have people from the world over, and by the way, the overarching argument does pertain to leadership and followership the world over, but particularly in this country, these same 30, 40 years have been a period during which leaders in general are in the decline, have declined in our estimation. Our levels of trust in government and business leaders, even nonprofit and military leaders, has gone down during exactly the same period that the leadership industry has grown exponentially. So this dichotomy or apparent paradox is what motivated me to explore the issue and to, in fact, write this relatively slender book about it. As you will see from the next slide, in general, I argue that, well, first of all, again, since for many years, decades, centuries, leaders have generally lost power and influence, and followers have generally gained it. Again, I argue this is a particularly strong concept in the last several decades. Because of this, I suggest that the leader-centrism with which we're all so familiar be expanded to include a more holistic model. And as I argue in the book, what I use in my classes and really in all my work at this point is a kind of equilateral triangle with no single side being more powerful or longer, if you will, than the other. So one side is leadership, the other, or leaders, the other side is followers, and the third side is context. So as I suggested, some of these trends are as old as human history, and I don't have to remind you of Plato and the philosopher King and Machiavelli and the Prince to remind you of the fact that in days gone by, the leader seemed to be, and indeed typically was, all-powerful. When I teach my course on leadership literacy, I point out that certainly in the West, Thomas Hobbes was the sea change author because he's the first one who took account as a political philosopher of us, that is, of followers. That is, he at least endowed us with the right to life. And his Leviathan, his classic The Leviathan, was built on that premise that we would give a leader authoritarian powers, but only if the leader in turn gave us the right to life and protected us from that. I don't need to go into John Locke. I think we're all familiar how he shifted the ground even further, how followers in his, that is, ordinary people, constituents, whatever label you want to give them, and I, by the way, don't want to get into the trap during this conversation of defining leaders and followers, although I'm happy to do so during the Q&A if the question comes up. But Locke, of course, was a sea change. He gave us the right to revolt and to throw out our legislators if they did not do what we wanted. This trend continued. We, of course, had the American and French revolutions, Thomas Paine's Common Sense, Marx and Engels in 1848, the ultimate follower volume, if you will, Workers of the World Unite, and then John Stuart Mill in his brilliant seminal essay called On Liberty, which talked about how really there should be no leaders at all because so long as we as individuals did not do harm to others, we ought to have the maximum amount of autonomy. So then I get to, again, this is all rather brief, of course, in the book. As I said, it's a slender volume to begin with, so you can imagine I treat this all quite quickly. But I do touch on leadership and change in the 20th century. Again, the impulse from the bottom up, people who previously had no power, authority, and influence whatsoever, demanding, seizing power, commanding influence to create change, whether it was Gandhi and Mandela, in this country, King and Friedan, the waning days of colonialism, the collapse of communism, which had great implications for democracies around the world, for increasing democracies around the world, and of course the rights revolutions, the civil rights revolution, the women's rights revolution, the gay and lesbian rights revolution, the animal rights revolution, you name it. Again, this enormous impulse from ordinary people, I call them followers, demanding rights that they simply did not have historically. So now I continue with leadership and change, but I start to get into the things that interest me most about the last 30, 40 years. I use the term cultural change here, and as you'll see, I get to the slide in a moment on technical or technological change. Here I think I'll simply point again to bullet points 3 and 4. I alluded earlier to the decline in trust in American individuals and institutions, and again, this is across the board, absolutely without exception. And it's worth pointing out with regard to slide number 4, the really, again, one could use the word exponential growth of democracies globally. And these are some Freedom House figures. In 74, 27% of countries were labeled democracies, and in 2000, that figure was up to 63%. It's even slightly higher now. So here's what I get into more contemporaneously. I guess I would say that I have argued in this book that culture and technology, more than any other single factors, I'm not saying they're the only factors, have contributed to the decline in our estimation of leaders, decline in leaders' capacity to lead, and similarly to the increase in followers being, or feeling at least, increasingly entitled and emboldened. I use now, you all know that changes in culture do not come with the strike of a gong. So I picked arbitrarily, and this is all, by the way, this whole argument is really open for debate and discussion. It's not frozen in stone. I don't claim every single thing I say is, the truth with a capital T. But to indicate the changes in the culture, I do often use the Bill Clinton, Monica Lewinsky episode as a kind of sea change, if you will, in the sense that we felt, again, emboldened and entitled to demean the person in the presidency in a way that arguably was unprecedented. The level of involvement in the president's sexual life, in his habits, the degree of information we had about all of this was fairly remarkable. And out of that, again, this was not as if it wasn't the case before Lewinsky, but out of that moment came a kind of enduring license on our part to pry and probe into what our leaders did and how they behaved, a license to demean and to diminish them, and increasingly also a license to disregard and depose them. And we see this over and over and over again. Along with this came technological changes, and there are several, I divide this into several categories. The first one is information. It used to be, as this slide implies, a private preserve, a precious resource. As we all know, information is now accessible to nearly anyone with the simple click of a who knows what. And the fact that we all know everything or can know everything has a kind of leveling effect. And it entitles us, or enables us, is a better word, I guess, to use, among other things, information as ammunition. When you know something about somebody, you can, if you are so disposed, use it to attack or assault them. Second aspect of technological change is expression. I don't want to belabor this point because by now we're all familiar with it. If we weren't before the Arab Spring, we certainly are now, but I want to make clear this is not just a political phenomenon. We see it in business all the time. Hardly a day goes by where we don't read or hear about some new online campaign, Twitter campaign, online petitioning to compel leaders, to compel people in positions of authority to step back, to retract what they had said was going to happen, to pull back. I call it sometimes the yes, I know I'm into pop culture, the Oprahization, and now I'm into the American idolization of American life. And by that I mean, and I refer often when I'm speaking to groups, to two television shows that kind of indicate what I mean. One is American Idol, and the other one is Dancing with the Stars, which a lot of people watch, and where previously in this kind of thing we would have had experts tell us who's the best singer or who's the best dancer. And now, again, it is the people, ordinary people, who really make the ultimate decisions, who weigh in as if they were experts. Again, this kind of leveling effect, the capacity that technology has to allow us to express our views and for those views to have an impact. Third aspect is connection, just knowing how other people think and feel. All of that empowers us, again, in ways that are really historically unprecedented, at least in terms of the speed and extent and range of this. And a second bullet point just refers to a whole slew of terms that are used for the so-called collective impact on decision-making as opposed to the leader's impact on decision-making. Finally, of course, the last part of this technological change is action. It allows us, the expression, the connection, and so forth and so on, allows us to act in certain ways, and I would argue to create change faster and more extensively than we had the capacity, by we, of course, I'm always referring to the followers and not the leaders, than we have ever had before. Now, what do I mean by social contract? Okay, so here's, and I have a chapter on this in the book, I argue that there has been, certainly in recent decades, a kind of contract, social contract, between leaders and followers. This has been the case during the era in which leaders have acceded to their positions of authority based on merit. What do I mean by merit? Any of you who are familiar with my book, Bad Leadership, know that to me, good very simply means effective and ethical. So to the third bullet point, the impact of culture on technology on the perception of merit is that it diminishes it. In other words, culture allows us to chide and to denigrate. Technology gives us the information we need to denigrate, and so we have a kind of ruptured, or at least, sundered social contract in which we are less able than we were before to think of our leaders as being meritorious and worthy, therefore, of our followership. And I do use the Catholic Church as an exemplar of this, but of course I will not dwell on this now. Nor will I particularly dwell on this slide. I think most of you can conjure what I've written about anyway. I do consider both Barack Obama's presidency, it was Hillary Clinton, after all, who was supposed to be the Democratic nominee, and the Tea Party to be indicators of people power, particularly during an era in which people power has generally been dismissed. We complain that there's less activism, people aren't marching in the streets the way they used to. The Occupy movement was kind of the first indicator of people power that we've had in a long time. I argue in the book that this people power has simply taken different forms, and I use one example from the left, so to speak, and one example from the right. And by the way, just to go back, as you can see, I consider that in the American experience, it's mainly been about downgrading leaders, whereas in the rest of the world, I argue that it's more about upgrading followers. So in Europe and in Asia, and of course most obviously perhaps in the Middle East, ordinary people have had a voice in ways that they did not previously. Europe's inability to get its fiscal act in order is due in great part to a populace, to followers, to ordinary citizens who refused to let their leaders do the work that they felt they needed to do. So that in France, for example, in 2010, when Sarkozy dared to move the retirement age from, I think, 60 to 62, no fewer than 2 million people took to the streets to protest. So followers in the rest of the world, I wish I could talk about China and Russia. I can't simply because of the time limits, but I do go into China and Russia to a fair degree in the book because I consider the changes that have happened in both countries since the collapse of communism, Chinese communism, still in the present notwithstanding, have been an enormous moment in terms of the kinds of trends that I'm talking about. So in my remaining minutes, let me get very quickly to what I call, as I described earlier, the leadership industry. Now, I guess most people, unlike most audiences that I talk to, I think most people on this webinar are in one way or another involved in the leadership industry, so it's a collective concern of ours. And I really open this discussion, not that I'm the first one to raise questions, by the way. Some of my colleagues have raised questions, and I can cite some quotes, and maybe I will, about what are we really doing in leadership studies, what are we really doing in terms of leadership development, how proven are our methods, so forth and so on. But generally speaking, the field continues quite unexamined, quite in the year 2012, the way it did in the 1970s and 80s, and again, these are some of the questions I'm trying to explore. I want to draw your particular attention on this slide to bullet points number 3 and 4, because what's interesting to me is how leadership has become this, and you all know this, I'm sure, this incredibly sexy, popular word. Everybody from grade school on, high school, wants to be a leader. And I particularly mention Harvard University because virtually every single one, and I cite this also in the book, every single one of its, to my amusement actually, of its professional schools has the word leadership or becoming a leader in its mission statement. And, you know, I question this in the end of leadership as well. I say, why does every lawyer have to be a leader? Why does everyone who goes to the Harvard Ed School have to be a leader? Is it no longer enough in this day and age to be simply a great lawyer or a great teacher? So among other things, I raise questions about the ubiquity of the word leadership, and I find the semantics and expectations thereof somewhat amusing as well as open to question. So these are some of the very basic questions. I know we all think that leadership can be learned, and I know we all think that leadership can be taught. I am suggesting that the metrics on this are thin. Let me quote one of my colleagues by the name of Richard Hackman, who talks about what he calls, and some of you may know this phrase, the leader attribution error, and I'm going to cite him rather than my own voice. He writes, everything I know about leadership courses suggests that when well executed, attendees absolutely love them. The problem is that research evidence that would document the benefits is hard to find. It may be hard to find because it does not exist. Again, I don't wish all of you to exile me to Leadership Siberia. I realize that raising some of this is quite controversial, but at least I want to have a more lively discussion than I think we've been able to have most of the time in during the last several decades. So here in this slide I raise, as you can see in front of you, some questions about issues that I think are really ongoing issues. God knows they've been around as long as I've been in the field, and that's several decades, obviously. We don't have much agreement on how words should be defined. What is a leader? I mean, there are 40 or 50 definitions of a leader. I finally defined follower in a way that at least suited me, if only because I wanted to introduce the word to our lexicon. I still find the degree to which followers are left out of the conversation absolutely baffling. I find it baffling intellectually, and I find it baffling theoretically. There's scant agreement on theory. There is scant agreement on sequence. What do I mean by sequence? It relates a little bit to the next point about pedagogy and also to the next point really about core curriculum. It's amazing that after all these years we have not, there's been no kind of field agreement on these are the things anybody who is learning how to be a leader should learn. This is the sequence in which people should learn these things. This is the pedagogy that is appropriate for this particular subject. I'm not asking for any sort of universal model that everybody has to follow, but I am rather struck by the fact that we've made, in my view anyway, rather little progress toward some of these fundamentals that characterize most fields. So let me quote from Rakesh Khurana about leadership studies. Leadership, Khurana writes in his book, From Higher Aims to Hired Hands, leadership as a body of knowledge remains without either a widely accepted theoretical framework or a cumulative empirical understanding leading to a usable body of knowledge. Now, statements like these are not frequent, and in fact they're rather few and far between, but those who have made them are generally among the best and brightest in our field, and it astonishes me also that we have given them so little attention. We sort of make believe that everything is fine, and I'm suggesting it's not quite as fine as we generally assume. So here are some of my questionable assumptions. I don't really need to tick them off. They're in the book. You can read them very quickly on this slide yourselves. I generally question some of the kind of work that we all do, not because I think it's bad or wrong-headed, but because I think we sort of don't assess our work well enough and we approach it as a field. I think we approach it by and large not sufficiently critically. Here is my sort of view of what I would think that leadership education might include. As you'll see very quickly, it's much more of a holistic approach, and I've deliberately shut the slides off because I just want to have you hear my voice at this time rather than fixate too much on the words. Basically, I do argue, as I said, for a more complete approach to the field of leadership, to the study of leadership, to teaching people how to be a leader, and to a more critical one in which we do a better job of assessing our efforts, a better job, maybe at the annual meetings of the International Leadership Association, of having critical conversations about what works and what doesn't, and trying to establish a greater sense of coherence to the field than we have been able to do so far. So I will conclude the presentation simply by saying that this is about, in the end, about leadership and change, about how it is different in 2012 from what it was 100 years, that is, leadership and followership are different in 2012 from what they were 10 years ago, 100 years ago, and that as the field of leadership studies and leadership education and development evolve, we should be evolving along with it. That is, getting to a place where we adjust our leadership learning along with our sense of how to teach it, how to use it, and how to make it work in our collective interest. I do believe in leadership. I do believe in followership. Patterns of dominance and deference are as important now as they ever were before, but I also think it's time for us to collectively review the field in ways that are more ambitious, perhaps, than what we have undertaken so far. So, Ellen, I'm kind of done with my monologue, and I guess we have 20-25 minutes to respond to questions in the event, Ellen, that you have some.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara. We have quite a few questions from our audience, and I will just go through those and pose some of those to you at this time. The first question comes from a graduate student who is wondering about what you would see as the future implications for young people, people just starting their careers in leadership development. What would be the implications of your work for them?
Well, thank you for the question. It's an interesting question because, among other things, one of the things I point to in the end of leadership several times over are, in fact, the generational differences with regard to attitudes towards leadership and followership. I think young people have an enormous advantage, in fact, over those of us who've been in the field for several decades. First of all, they understand viscerally as well as intellectually the cultural changes to which I refer. Every time you see studies of this kind of thing, young people expect when they go into the workplace, and by the way, again, this is not just a domestic American phenomenon. This is a global phenomenon. Young people are at the cutting edge of some of the changes that I'm talking about. Again, culturally, their level of expectation about ideas of authority, ways that I want to work, things I'm looking for and forward to in my communal life, in my political life, in my professional life are not like those of their predecessors. They're much more equitable and much less tolerant of authority relationships as we historically have understood them. And needless to say, the changes in technology are stunningly more accessible to younger people than to their elders. When we look at the Arab Spring, almost entirely it was a phenomenon of technology as well as culture, but the technology part in particular was driven by the young. The older people of Mubarak's senior generation, they didn't even know what was going on. So I think a young person, to the degree that they stay ahead of the curve, that they understand leadership patterns of dominance and deference, leadership and followership in the present and in the future as opposed to the past, they're going to be ahead of the game. So if I were asked, I would say focus on technology and culture as global phenomena, not particularly as domestic phenomena.
Okay, thank you for that. Our next question is of a very different sort. Do you see power and influence as a zero-sum game in terms of leadership? In other words, does the power and influence of leaders necessarily negate the power and influence of followers, or vice versa, does the power and influence of followers necessarily take away from that leaders can exercise?
Right, right. Thank you. Another really, we should have a seminar of several hours on this one. I try very hard in my classes and increasingly in my writing, although you're less able to do it in writing because you have to have some sense of definition. But certainly when I speak to groups, including my students, I try very hard not to get stuck in labels. So often people will say to me, okay, so-and-so was a nobody, but then so-and-so created change. Doesn't that mean that the person is a leader and not a follower? Well, as some of you may know, I define followers as people who have little or no power, little, by definition, no authority, and little or no influence. As they accumulate power and influence, they don't accumulate authority, again by definition, they become either empowered followers or leaders or whatever you want to call them. The label is not what interests me. The phenomenon is what interests me. And as the question suggests, this is a fungible phenomenon. It is not a zero-sum game because leaders and followers change roles and shift roles within time. At any given moment in time, they can change roles, and they change roles within institutions and within communities. So I don't see it as a zero-sum game, and even if it were a zero-sum game, it could be a different zero-sum game an hour from now from what it is at the present. So to me, this is all exceedingly fluid. And the fluidity, again, to get back to culture and technology, the rapidity and fluidity of the changes are just astonishing. And again, not a day goes by where you don't read about some amazing phenomenon, whether it's the Coney 2012 video or Apple in China and how that was being taken on, or the Susan B. Komen Foundation, what's happening in Russia, what's happening with Trayvon Martin. all episodes where the fluidity in relations between leaders and followers is so great that to get stuck on labels seems to me to be misguided. They're just not suitable for the 21st century, less suitable probably in the future than they are even now. And above all, I think the word leader and the way, you know, the baggage we still carry around with that word seems to me to be increasingly dated.
Okay, thanks. In your text, you mentioned that people grow away from existing patterns. And in some cases, they fight their way out through a revolution of rights. What, in your view, characterizes the current pattern of leader and followers that might, as we go into the future, be the one that people grow away from? What's the current pattern?
Yeah, I think, Ellen, if I'm understanding the question correctly, the answer is, and I often give this as an answer to the great irritation of people who ask me questions, it depends. In other words, if this question were being asked in China, that would be one set of responses. If it's being asked in the United States, is another set of responses. If it's being asked in the context of Google, that's one thing. If it's being asked in the context of a small mom and pop store in Brazil, that's something different. Much of this is, that's why, to go back to my triangle, leaders on one side, followers on another, and the third necessary last side of the triangle is context. So what are people trying to get away from? Again, it depends on context. I have watched with great interest what's gone on in Russia in the last several months. I'm sure all of you know that Putin decided in the fall of 2011 that he wanted to run again for president. He'd been president 12 years. He wanted to run again. There are 6-year terms, and we all know that he won, and that he may well now be president again for another 6 years and possibly even for another 12. But what happened in response to his announcing that he was going to run again was unprecedented in modern Russian history. The fact that it was not this people's revolt in the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg in particular, they were, especially the urban Russian, much less the rural Russian, they were trying to get it away from the authoritarian patterns of the past. Now, they were not immediately successful in ways that some of us might have imagined, but it's extremely important. And if I had to predict the trajectory of Russia over the next 10 years or so, I would bet that it's toward increasing democratization and that Putin will have an increasingly difficult time simply trying to decree this and decree that. So what we're trying to get away from, Ellen, and this may be too long an answer, really depends on the situation in which we find ourselves, and it varies from situation to situation.
Well, this person who sent in this question seems to have read your book already, because they do give us a context in the second part of the question. It's in the Netherlands, and the person is saying in the Netherlands more and more emphasis is placed on flexible work. Basically, offices are fitted so a maximum number of people can share a single desk. People work at home. They're linked to work through the Internet. So how does this kind of a context affect the relationship between leaders and followers, and how do you see that playing out in the future?
Yeah, well, I actually don't think I mentioned that in the book, but I love the addition of that flattened hierarchy, leveled workplace to the conversation. I do refer to that in more general terms. I don't think I mentioned the Netherlands specifically. Look, that's what many people would consider a utopian professional arrangement. It seems to get this is, by the way, a gender issue too. I talk quite a bit about women in leadership, as some of you know, lamenting the fact that for all the progress women have made in terms of leadership, it's just dismal. The numbers of women leaders, particularly again in the United States, but again a global phenomenon, either in the private sector or in the public sector, remains remarkably low. So one of the reasons, and I piggyback this point on to the description of the workplace that we just heard, is because one of the reasons has to do with work-life, family balance issues, and who cares for the kids, and who runs the household, and so forth and so on. So the description, this description of the workplace that we just heard, is very much it appears, the 21st century model with a much more equitable distribution of power relations. I'm just using the word power in a very broad sense at this point. And with employees having a relatively workers, followers, subordinates, again, whatever word you want to use is fine with me, feeling increasingly empowered and indeed entitled to define their own work lives so long as they get the work done. And in many cases, this involves job sharing. It involves high degree of autonomy about when you do your work. You can get there very early. It means you can leave a little bit later. Your relations with your superiors, you know, these cultural changes that I talked about. I sometimes say to groups that I'm talking to, you know, in the old days, I'm so old that when I walked into a classroom, I was automatically addressed as Professor Kellerman. And nowadays, half the students, I walk into a classroom, I would say a good number of the students simply call me Barbara, and I joke around, I say I'm lucky they don't call me Babs. So this is in the office too. Increasingly, you know, this whole notion of the hierarchy, as we know, that's out the window. But we also know that many people, if you go on to the web and you Google the term bad boss, you will find, and you ask, by the way, any group, how many of you have had bad bosses, you will find that for all the language about flattened hierarchy and empowerment and teams, many, many, many people, indeed, I would argue the great majority of people still do feel themselves and indeed are embedded in hierarchical professional relationships. So the description of the workplace in the Netherlands, I think to many, many people, again, if not overwhelming majority of people, would seem near utopian. I, of course, would argue it is also increasingly the wave of the future.
Great, thank you. We have had a request for you to comment on the following. It is my belief that the failure of leadership and the growth of the leadership industry stem from a common cause, the focus on the how of leadership, that is methods and approaches, and a lack of focus on the why of leadership, that is goals and purposes. We seem to have ignored the question leadership for what purpose, as well as lack of agreement on the answer to what is a good life. Can you comment on that?
I agree. You know, I totally agree, but I guess I would push it a little further. I would say it's only one of the many things we've ignored. We ignore the point or the purpose, and we do focus on skills. And that's one of my objections, that we focus so much on skills, decision-making and negotiating and communicating without, as the questioner, I'm sorry, I don't know your names, as the questioner implies, without asking the larger question. As I said, I agree, but I would push it much further. I think we tend to train leaders in silos. Let me, Ellen, if I can just take a moment to make another point. Increasingly, leadership training and education is moving away from the academy, away from undergraduate and graduate institutions, including schools of business, to in-house leadership training programs. I'll mention a few. I'll mention maybe one of the most well-known, two of the most well-known, Goldman Sachs and GE. GE is the most esteemed and touted leadership training and development program in the world within a corporation. It was Jack Welch's baby, and to this day it is a source of great pride to GE. I actually don't want to comment on whether it's a good program or not. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is that even if it is we're completely brilliant, and let's assume for the sake of this point that it is, what it's doing is training leaders to be wonderful leaders within GE. This brings me back to the question. So what is the purpose of learning how to be a leader? Is the purpose of learning how to be a leader to be a great leader within GE? Or are there some larger questions that are being left unaddressed by these kinds of leadership training programs? Are there larger social purposes? Is it an accident that the great problems are being left unattended or at least unresolved, whether it's national debt, whether it's health care, whether it's poverty, whether it's nuclear disarmament, whether it's terrorism, whether it's the environment and climate change, you name it. We struggle in the present with those as we have in the past. So I guess one of the arguments for sure that I make in the end of leadership is that leadership training should be far, far, far more broad-based. It should be longer, it should be more sustained, it should be less narrow, it should be more grounded in the liberal arts. So by a whole host of measures, I agree with the questioner, and I take his point or her point even far further than was implied by the question.
Okay, I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. We're getting some requests for definitional kinds of things and just say more about certain concepts. So can you say a little bit about how you define leadership, and then whether you think people have to be effective followers before they can be effective leaders? And then the idea of contextual intelligence. Say a little bit more about that.
Okay, Ellen, I may end up having you repeat some of that. Let's go. I think you had 3 questions collapsed into one.
Yeah, so the
can you
first
take them in order?
You know, what is your definition of leadership?
Okay.
And do people have to be effective followers before they can be effective leaders?
Okay. I'm going to read, with regard to my definition of leadership, somebody's going to be very angry, or a lot of you are going to be very angry with me, but I'm sure you're angry with me anyway. But let me read from my book on just that issue of definitions. I should say, again, I've been around, as you all know, a long time. I've written on leadership for many years, lots of different books. And maybe it's just that I'm tired of the definitional question, or maybe I'm tired of the lack of agreement. But here is what I say in the introduction to the end of leadership. I think, by the way, most of you received it. I say, I avoid like the plague definitions of leadership, of which at last count there were some 1,500, and theories of leadership, of which at last count there are around 40. Instead, I keep it simple. I assume that leadership development implies developing good leaders, and that good leaders are both, and this I said earlier, are ethical and effective. You know, this is one of those let 100 flowers bloom or 1,000 flowers bloom. I tell my students they can define leadership and indeed followership or a leader any way they like. We've not reached agreement on how to define it in all these decades of the leadership industry. I don't think we're about to do that. All I ask is that people, if you're writing a paper or having a conversation, that you come up with your own definition and make clear how you are using the word leader and how you are using the word follower. With regard to the second part of the question about whether you have to learn how to be a good follower before you learn how to be a good leader, no, I don't. I happen not to think there's any sequential relationship here. I do think, though, and you probably have gleaned this by now, that teaching good leadership without simultaneously teaching good followership makes no sense at all. The follower, you know, the more you look into this, I promise you, the more you look into the question of what is followership and what does it mean to be a good follower, the more you will come to understand that it is every bit as important as good leadership, and that any good outcome, whether you're talking about Obamacare or whatever, any place on the planet, is as dependent on good followers as it is on good leaders. And I would go so far even as to suggest, and this, you know, I realize is you know, not to everyone's liking, that our fixation on developing good leaders is not unrelated to the fact that our systems, our political systems in particular, are working so poorly. We have lost our understanding of what it means to teach civic engagement. We used to have courses on civics. You know, what does it mean to be a good citizen? What is good citizenship? Why don't we teach that to the same degree that we used to? Why don't we teach people how not to be bystander followers, how to become engaged? Why don't we teach people how to be bold followers instead of timid followers, involved followers instead of absent followers? So I guess I'm saying I think the lack of attention to followership has a lot to do with the misguided nature of a lot of the leadership teaching, and the only thing I would plead for, apropos the original question about definitions, is not to get too entwined or entrapped by definitions, but to have rather fluid conceptions of both words, because indeed they are fluid and should be adaptable to the changing circumstance.
Well, I'd like to skip to a question that has been inserted here in my screen multiple times, so the person really, really, really wants an answer.
Okay.
Isn't the end of leadership about the rise of unfollowers? In other words, global citizens not wanting to be part of any failing leadership process, who want their own collective visions to be realized through their own actions?
Yeah, I love the question because yes, 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 and yes. But that's why I'm saying let's not get hung up on definitions of the word. I think the questioner is in total agreement with what I'm saying, or I'm in total agreement with you. That is, the terms, the fixation on leader in terms of position makes no sense anymore. But follower needs to be more, a follower, as I use the word, and I started using the word that way in the book Followership. A follower is not by definition a passive person. I simply use the word, as I think I said, in terms of rank. So by definition, a follower has no authority because they don't have any rank, they don't have any status. That doesn't mean, however, that followers can't gain unto themselves power, and that followers can't, that is, ordinary people, can't gain unto themselves influence. So yes, I think it's about people no longer willing, especially as a global political phenomenon, as I think the question implied, to go along with leaders in whom they do not believe and whom they don't trust. But I attach to that word, since I think it's a phenomenon of ordinary people, as with a revolution, although most of these are not literally revolutions, many of them, some of them are, it is about a phenomenon from the bottom up, change being created from the bottom up. It's not a new phenomenon, but we have seen plenty of evidence of it over the last 30, 40 years, maybe especially in the last 10, although the collapse of communism certainly was part of that, what we're talking about. And I wish simply to take that larger phenomenon into account when we use the term leadership studies or leadership training and development.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question, maybe two. This individual thanks you for your continuing critical assessment of leadership and says, some time ago you pointed out our mistake of studying headship rather than leadership. I wonder if your new book is more about the end of headship, that is, leadership as position and hierarchy. How do we make the jump from leadership as position to leadership as action, or I would add process, which anyone with or without authority can undertake? Does your emphasis on followership keep us locked into a hierarchical approach to leadership rather than the common field of action that we see going on?
Yeah. Very smart question. Thank you so much. They're all great questions. Thank you. Maybe, it is true that you could argue that semantics drive some of this, that by adopting the word followership, I'm simply sticking to the leadership notion and I'm not expanding the concept. When I wrote the book Followership, I wrestled with that, and and Robert Kelly before me and Ira Chaliff at the same time, 2 or 3 other people have talked about followership. I'm not the only one, although compared to the billion that talk about leadership, we're in a very small minority. I think we all struggle with that word for just the reasons that the question implies. I'm willing to give up followership when the rest of the world gives up leadership. I'm happy, as I said. I think the biggest mistake we can make is to get trapped in this language. I've decided to put forth the word followership simply because of the way the English language works. It's, to me, the natural obverse of leadership. But I am happy to see this issue. I'm happy to see the nomenclature for a more expansive view of how change really is created. And in that sense, I think the questioner and I are very much on the same page.
Okay, I'll just read what's actually a comment, I think, that relates to what you just said from one of the listeners. Leaders are followers to a certain extent as well. Leaders are subject to pressures from followers. Therefore, followers bear a responsibility as well for the quality of leadership that we currently have. I like your point that we need to educate followers how to be better followers. Would you have any closing comment about that?
Well, I'm grateful for the point that I didn't make and the questioner did make, which is the degree to which leaders follow. That's, again, something that's typically lost. There is no leader, well, I guess you could say, North Korea or, a few totalitarian exceptions. But by and large, in the 21st century, no leader is exempt from being a follower, whether it's a CEO who has to pay attention more than he did or she did, mostly he, of course, even 10 years ago, to the board, to shareholder activists, to stockholders. Everybody's got this voice now, and leaders who don't pay attention to those so-called follower voices are idiots. So yes, from the president on down, CEOs on down, leaders have to follow. They have to pay attention to their constituencies more than ever before, and that is absolutely one of the overarching points I'm making in the end of leadership.
Okay, at this time, I would like to bring a close to the questions, and thank you so much, Barbara, for taking the time to be with us today. I think this was just a fascinating, in-depth look at not only, kind of what you've done in the book, a good overview, but some really interesting insights. And I want to thank the people who submitted questions as well, although I wasn't able to get to all of those, obviously, even given the generous amount of time. A lot of the questions, we had an awful lot of questions, very good ones. And I would like to now announce the winners of the book giveaway. 4 of today's participants were randomly selected to receive a copy of Barbara's latest book, and they are Kelly Jordan, Anton Camarota, Scott Yorkovich, and Dina Banerjee. So congratulations to those folks. And if you enjoyed today's webinar, I hope you'll also be able to join us for the next installment of the Leadership Perspectives webinar series, which will be upcoming in April. Details will be on the website soon, so please do check into the website for that, visiting www.ila-net.org for more details. So hope you all have a wonderful day, and thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Ellen, and thanks to everybody who participated. Bye-bye.
Bye.